Welcome to the Women's March Canada podcast, making the equality of women in Canada the new norm. This is episode 27, titled Power in Politics. My name is Melissa Durrell, and I'm your host, inspiring, uniting, and leading the charge for the advancement of women across Canada. Please give a warm welcome to this week's guest, Bhutila Karpoche. Bhutila is this year's NDP candidate for Parkdale, so in Toronto, Ontario. She served on the board of directors for the Canadian Tibetan Association of Ontario and as a member of the International Tibetan Network. Gaining a master's degree in public health, which we're going to talk a little bit about that, from the University of Toronto. Bhutila has taken her passion for public health into politics, which I think is so interesting. But let's start at the beginning. You immigrated here in 2002. So talk to me a little bit about what that was like to come to Canada from Tibet.
Oh, absolutely. So actually my parents were born in Tibet, and they escaped Tibet after the invasion and fled and settled in Nepal, where I was born. But Tibetans in Nepal are not recognized, so everybody there is considered technically as stateless people. So I was born as a stateless person in Nepal. We didn't have the same rights as people, even though my family had lived there for quite a few decades. And a civil war broke out, and there was a lot of turmoil. And so my family decided to move again, and we came to Canada.
Do you know why they chose Canada?
Oh, I'm not exactly making. I was 18 years old, but of course, Canada has such a reputation internationally as being so welcoming. It's of course a democracy, which was so important. Also, we knew that there was a small Tibetan community that had settled, and so those connections also, I think, ultimately led us here.
So you came here, and for you, you were settling. Or did you ever have plans to go back, or Canada's your home now?
Oh no, Canada's home. Of course, when I came here, I didn't know anything about Canada, so it was quite surreal because I came, moved across oceans and continents, and finally arrived in Canada, and I first day in Canada was July 1st, Canada Day. And I didn't know it was Canada Day, but I thought, wow, Canada is really fun. Everybody's in such a great mood. But, we landed in Parkdale, which sometimes the neighborhood's known as the landing strip for a lot of different new immigrant groups, and the Tibetan community had settled there. And I just knew when I landed in Parkdale, my gosh, this was home. I saw older Tibetan ladies walking down the street with their traditional outfits. I could go anywhere to get roti. So it was such a diverse and had such a strong feeling of belonging. We had such great neighbors who helped us out, even though we were complete strangers, and a really strong sense of community. So I knew I was home.
That's amazing. So, well, talk to me then, because I think, is it that welcome that you got and that feeling of belonging that has led you to want to step up to be a leader in your community, do you think? Because you're running for the NDP now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I tell this to everybody, is that it's very challenging to settle in a new country. And, despite all of the challenges, I always felt that things were going to be okay. And that's because of that sense of belonging. And it's a very powerful feeling because you feel hopeful. You feel like, okay, you know what? Things are going to get better. We're going to work through it. And at the end of the day, it's going to be good. So that hopeful feeling is really powerful. And I wanted to make sure that in our communities, everybody feels like they belong. Right? So whether it's around housing issues and people feeling like they're being pushed out because of increasing rents and things like that, we work on these issues and we send the message that everybody belongs here.
And that actually inspired your education as well. So how are you you've got a master's in
public health, yeah.
in public health. And social determinants is sort of the thing that you're that this is your passion, I guess. Is that right? So
Yes.
talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, no, I've always been interested in health and how we can keep people, communities healthy. But as I grew older, I realized and I learned that health is less about the biology or the behavior of people, but it's really about social and economic policies. There are so many factors that drive health, and overwhelmingly, it's government policies, right? So when we talk about health and women's health, even, we have to talk about housing issues, we have to talk about childcare, we have to talk about workers' rights issues. All of these things drive how individual and communities' health are. So for me, if I wanted to take action on health and keeping people healthy, I needed to work on the social policies that were driving people's health. And so I got very involved in workers' rights issues, in making sure that everybody has fair wages and benefits. I got involved in tenant organizing to make sure that people have decent housing, right? People can live with dignity, because housing is not just about a roof over your head. It's about health and dignity as well.
Mm-hmm. And do you have any stories you can share with us around, when you first start to get involved, I guess these were larger organizations, or were some of the things that you were doing individually led?
Yeah, I think even my work in, for example, workers' rights, right, which is a huge determinant of health. It's really based on my own lived experiences, because when I came to Canada, one of my first jobs was working through a temp agency in a factory. And I will never forget, I used to stand in the corner of King and Dufferin, which is, a prominent intersection in Parkdale. There's a McDonald's there. And I would stand in the parking lot of that McDonald's in the early afternoon, wait for the temp agency van to show up. It would not just be me, it'd be a group of people. And the person from the temp agency would be like, okay, I need 12 people today, right? And then he would pick the 12 people that was going to get work. And at that time, I didn't know where they were driving us to, but it turns out it was Mississauga. So I worked in factories, and I didn't realize at the time I was working, but I soon learned that I was not being paid the same as somebody who's standing in the same assembly line doing it. And because I was working through a temp agency, I didn't have any of the workplace protections, let alone any benefits. And not only that, I learned that the temp agency was not only charging me for the travel back and forth to the factory, but also taking money per hour of my work, right? So all of these things, I was like, oh my gosh, this is, it was different because I was young. It was not that my family was depending on my income for rent, but it was, for many people, that's how they paid rent. That's how they put food on their table, right? And it's very, very important that if we want to keep people healthy, we want to make sure they have food on their table, that they're able to pay rent, that they have fair wages and benefits, that everybody's treated equally.
That's right. And that really does come down to government legislation. So I can see how you drew that line really quickly. It's very interesting. So what's your community like today, Parkdale like today?
Sorry, you froze a little bit. I didn't catch.
Sorry, what's Parkdale like today?
So Parkdale is, like many neighborhoods in the city, experiencing rapid gentrification.
Right.
But is also a very tight-knit community that is, very well organized. So, for example, just in the last 2 years in Parkdale, we've had 2 rent strikes, which involved more than 300 tenants across, I think, 10 or 12 buildings.
What is a rent strike?
A rent strike is basically when tenants withhold paying rent to the landlord because of a certain issue. So the issue that they were striking against was the unfair above guideline rent increases that the landlord was passing on to the tenants. which was making rent unaffordable for many, which for some that I spoke to made a difference of whether they could continue to live in their unit or go, out on the streets, right? So they fought against that. We're also home in just maybe a year and a half to two food terminal strikes. Lots of people who work in the nearby Ontario food terminal live in Parkdale. So here you have a neighborhood where the residents, mostly tenants, are striking against their landlord at home,
yeah,
and struggling against their employer at the workplace. That's the kind of struggle that people are experiencing. But it's a community, and the people are, they have that fighting spirit.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just the tenants who go through this, the entire community comes together to support them. We had, for example, teachers from the local public school organized rallies in support of the tenants, right? Which generated quite a bit of media attention on this as well. So we have lots of different community issues, community groups organizing around these issues, and trying to make sure that Parkdale is a home for everybody who wants to call it home, regardless of who you are, how much you earn. And, it's a place that you can belong.
It's interesting because we are seeing this happen in a lot of our urban, I think across Canada, the sort of the top big 10 urban centers are all really seeing this gentrification and rents rising and it becoming unaffordable to live in the core, which has traditionally been a place that's been less expensive. What are some of the policies that you think can help that?
Oh, absolutely. So the main thing is looking at this piece of legislation called the Residential Tenancies Act. And that act has basic rent control guidelines built into it. Unfortunately, right now, it's ridden with loopholes that favor the landlord. So we need to make sure that we close these loopholes. So things like if, there's a certain guideline that rent increases have to follow, but landlords are often almost annually increasing the rents above the guidelines. We need to try and stop and limit that. Secondly, a lot of tenants, especially who've lived in their units for a longer period of time, they've seen their rent increase at a slower rate. So the landlords are trying to push them out of the units because they know that once the unit is vacated, they can double or even triple the rent, right? And these are usually older people, seniors who've lived there, 10, 15, 20 years. So we need to make sure that the landlord is not able to increase the rents so dramatically. I'd personally like to see the rent control tied to the unit rather than the person living in it. So the landlord has no incentive to push tenants out of their units, right? We've heard lots of stories of like direct harassment from landlords against tenants. So things like that. There are a number. The two that I mentioned are some of the two key ones that are really, pushing tenants out of their homes.
So you are Torontoite. You love it. Have you got to travel across Canada at all?
Yes. I've been to Timmins in the winter.
Ooh, that is bold.
Snowmobiling. No, yeah. And when I was an undergraduate student and I didn't have, much money, I went to UBC for my undergrad. So the semester ended and it was summer break. Instead of taking a flight, which would be quite expensive, I actually took the Greyhound bus from Vancouver to Toronto. And I stopped in every city along the way from, Regina, Winnipeg, Calgary. We drove across the prairie. I basically saw Canada, from the Rockies to the prairies, down the lakes and up to Toronto. That was good.
That's a pretty good way.
It took 5 days of, 24-hour bus ride, but.
So how are you involved with Women's March Canada? Did you march in Toronto?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I've marched every year now, twice, right? Yeah.
And why do you march?
Oh, gosh, for so many reasons. Because I truly believe that, if we're serious about housing, work rights, being pro-immigrant, all of these things all intersects with who we are as women, right? So I really believe that if we want true equity, women's movements need to include everybody. And so I feel that I need to do my part in being part of that movement.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Oh,
How can people find you? What's your Twitter, Facebook? How can people find you?
Absolutely. Very simple. It's just at Bhutila Karpoche, my name, Bhutila Karpoche, and the same with Facebook and Instagram.
That's right. No Snapchat? Not there.
No, I'm too old for that.
Well, thank you so much for speaking with us today. And yeah, thanks to everyone who's tuned in.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you're amazing. Good luck in the election.
Thank you so much, Melissa. Bye.
Goodbye. So thanks to everyone who's tuned in to listen. Your comments are welcome and encouraged. Please subscribe to our Women's March Canada channel and receive updates every time we upload a new podcast. Our mission across Canada is to stand together in solidarity with our partners and children for the protection of our rights, our safety, our health, and our families, recognizing that a vibrant and diverse communities are the strength of our country. This is the Women's March Canada podcast. You can find us on Twitter at Women's March CDA and on our website at womensmarchcanada.com. I'm Melissa Durrell. Have a great day. And we are done.